I've been somewhat melancholy today on this Mother's Day because I could not help but think of my own mother, who's now been with the Lord for over 9 years. In fact, it was this Mother's Day 9 years ago that I invited Mom to come to church, and I had a pulpit interview with her that day. And Mom at the time was 81 years of age. For those of you that didn't know her, she was a remarkable lady. She went as a single missionary to China when she was 26 years of age, flaming red-headed person, and strong constitution and a great heart. And in that interview, I always know my mother to be a woman of prayer. She spent hours a day in prayer. And knowing this, I just spontaneously popped a question at her in that interview. I said, Mom, has there ever been a day in my life where you did not pray for me? And she sort of scrunched up her face, and I could see her wrinkle her nose when she was thinking. She said, well, she said, there may have been 2 or 3. I was 37 at the time. I thought that was a remarkable record of continuity in prayer. And, you know, it almost seems trite to say it on Mother's Day, but it's true nevertheless. We are, to a great degree, what our mothers have made us and what they've prayed us into being. Well, it's not easy to select a text for Mother's Day. For one thing, half the audience is men, and I don't want to leave them out of a sermon. And then we've got, among the women that are here, mothers and women who are not mothers. And then within the mothers, we have varying levels. For example, do I direct a sermon at mothers of growing children or mothers of grown children? And there are mothers who have wonderfully warm and positive relationships with their children, and there are other relationships that probably today are strained. There are happy mothers and grieving mothers. There are those of you who this is your first day of being a mother, and others of you this is your first Mother's Day that your mother is not with you because of death. Mother's Day is great for some people and it's tough on others. I realize that as a pastor. You can't help but realize those things as a pastor. I want to avoid, however, 2 extremes I have seen sometimes people like myself in the pulpit take on Mother's Day. One extreme is what I call the extreme of poetic idealism, where we launch these wonderful descriptions of womanhood and motherhood, these idealistic phrases and qualities that nobody can identify with in real life. And the other thing that I want to stay away from is to use the sermon as a club. I've seen that also done on Mother's Day, where now, woman, on Mother's Day, it's time to get your house in order. Pray more, work more, give more, sow more, cook more, whatever. And you walk away just really feeling guilty on your day. I want to strike somewhere a center balance and take as a text the book of Ruth, which is a little book tucked away near the beginning of the Old Testament, between the book of Judges, which is the 7th book, and the book of 1 Samuel, which is the 9th book. A little short book containing 4 chapters. It's really a romance story. I'm not going to read it. If you'd like to just keep it open before you, it's a familiar story. There is a mother in there today that I'd like to talk about. She's also a mother-in-law, and her name is Naomi. And her story runs through all 4 of these chapters of great romance. I'm going to call her the mom for all seasons. She has a universal story for everybody, whether it's man or woman or whether you're a mother or not a mother. There's some things that happen in her life that have such wonderful application to every one of our lives here today. For my outline, I'd like to pretend that I'm that you're the color consultant for Naomi. There are color consultants in this congregation. Some have, for example, come up to me and shared that brown looks good on me. So sometimes I wear brown, but my chief color consultant, Jewel, says that I look best in dark blue on Sunday mornings, so that's what I try to do. I talked to Jewel, though, the other day, and I said, you know, on the farewell Sunday on June 5th, what I'd really like to wear is a bright yellow suit. and my real personality would show. My mother had a tremendous love for color. She just liked to wear plenty of it. Clashing pastels was especially her trademark. And she would wear a hat, a dress, and shoes that would be bright yellow, bright blue, bright green, bright chartreuse. They would all be there in wonderful palette paint quality. And I just, there's a dash of that in me as well that stays pretty much subdued. But Naomi was a woman of color, and I'm going to color her by the seasons of the year and call her the woman of summer, the woman of fall, the woman of winter, and the woman of spring. I want to find her, first of all, in her summer color. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." That almost had to be summer. In Israel, the rains come in January and February. The crops, spring crops, are planted in March and harvested in April, May. And it is famine time if there have been no rains and no crops by summer. And it's scorching hot. Just a travel tip, if you're ever going to do a Holy Land tour, don't go in July and August or even late June. It's just too hot. I would suspect, therefore, that chapter 1, verse 1 finds Naomi in summer. It's archetypally a turbulent and stress-filled time in her life. For not only is it an economically distressed time where there is famine, but it's also a religiously and politically distressing time. The writer of Ruth lets us know that it is the day when the judges ruled. And we know from backtracking in history that that was a period of a little or over 400 years. And Naomi stands at the end of that period of time, a time which the last verse in Judges described as, "In those days Israel had no king, everybody did as he saw fit," which meant that there was a lot of personal and human anarchy in those centuries. And I would submit that in such an uncertain era, politically, economically, it was no time to have children. In fact, if you want to take it at face value, there's probably never a good time to have children. I look at having children in the turbulent 60s when we had ours, and sometimes I had second thoughts about committing to that. And I'm sure that parents now in the late 80s, when you know your children are going to be teenagers in the year 2001 and beyond, wow, it's a frightening time, isn't it? And Naomi did not have a lot of the resources that we have today. We have far greater political and religious stability, let alone economic stability. Plus we have everything else like Christian schools and a church and religious storybooks and the Bible and print and religious videos. Why, Naomi did not even have Dr. James Dobson to go on. How can you raise a child and not listen carefully to what he's saying about the family? What a gift he is to the body of Christ. But she didn't have that. She was just out there in the little town of, truly little town of Bethlehem, on the edge of the Judean wilderness, trying to raise a family, unknown to humanity at large. You know, most of us are that way. We're common and ordinary people. Will Durant, the great historian, a number of years ago, in fact, it was a 1963 interview in Life magazine. I clipped it out. It was so interesting. I've saved it over the years. Said this. He indicated, civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things historians usually record, while on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is a story of what happens on the banks. Historians are pessimists because they ignore the banks for the river. Well, Naomi is not a person who's in the river. She's not the person out of which headlines are made. That's what history talks about. She's one of those people like us that is living out her life on the banks in the quiet, kind of unremembered ways. But even on the banks of life, on the banks of civilization, people get into turbulence and difficulty. And the great thing is God's aware of it. God is aware of ordinary people like Naomi, like you, like me. And He's aware that this summertime is a tough time for Naomi and her family. But she still, in the summer, has committed herself to a venture of motherhood, and children are brought into the world. We see her colors turn to fall. Fall is the time when the leaves and the grass are browning. The days become shorter, and winter is approaching. Naomi begins to face that fall in her life with a dreaded word that a wife and mother can face. It is the word relocation. Not just relocation to another city within the same country, but relocation to a foreign land where a foreign language is spoken. It'd be like some of you, your husband coming home and saying, my work has transferred me to Guadalajara, Mexico, and we're leaving next week. And while the people in Guadalajara enjoy Guadalajara greatly because you may not know Spanish or the culture or anybody in Guadalajara, it'd be a difficult thing for you just to simply pick up and go. But when your husband can't work, you move on. And that's what Naomi had to do here. And it's an odd paradox that they can't have enough to eat, can't get enough to eat in Bethlehem. The very name Bethlehem literally means house of bread. All around Bethlehem, if you go there even today, it's a tremendous grain-raising area. It's fertile fields. But that place of supply had become a place of emptiness. And what happens to Naomi is simply representative of the kinds of things that happen to us in life that are distressing. Things we didn't ask for, things that we have no control over. They occur to us, and we're like helpless. We're filled with life and we're filled with energy, but we can't do anything about the circumstances that are turning negative in our life. A physical relocation can be such a distressing event. A death of a loved one, some unpleasant thing can be that distressing moment. And it affects Naomi, and it affects us. In fact, she gave her son two names which show how much this time affected their family. Naomi's name means lovely, pleasant, beautiful, and her husband's name, Elimelech, meant my God is king. Isn't that a great name, by the way? Who's your husband? My husband is my God is king. You know, and Elimelech, who's your wife? My wife is beautiful, lovely, pleasant, delightful. Wow. What red-blooded American male or male of any nationality wouldn't be glad to say something like that? My wife is beautiful, lovely, pleasant, cheerful. But when their sons are born, oh, another story. You can tell it's summer and it's fall. Mahlor and Chilion. What do those names mean? Mahlor means weak or sick. Can you imagine his playmates at school? Hey, sick, come over here. And Chilion, his name he's the second child, and he's got one up on Mahlor. His name means failing, pining, annihilation, consumptive. Hey, consumptive, come over here. I just can't imagine those little boys telling anybody their names. It's a real contrast to the good self-image the little boy named Andrew had, who returned home from his first day at school and promptly announced to his mother that he was the best-looking boy in the class. His mother asked him who told him that, and he said, nobody told me that, I just took a look around at everybody else there. Poor Mahlor and Chilion. Naomi and Elimelech appear not to be God's people of faith and power. When the going gets tough, they leave. They don't make their stand. They make some mistakes. I could have told them as a armchair psychologist that they called their kids by the wrong name if they wanted to develop a healthy, positive self-image. All parents make mistakes. One of the best things, by the way, we as children can do for our parents is let them be human and not hold them to our idealized standard of perfection. But before we leap to judgment on Naomi and accuse her of being a bad mother, let's remember that had the Lord condemned her, we would not be hearing about her today, 3,000 years later. The Lord did find something delightful and pleasant in her. But fall was a rough time for her. It was relocation to a land to the east and south of the Dead Sea, the land of Moab with its very rugged hills and its little fertile valleys tucked away in the midst of the hills. Fall was followed by winter, and that was the toughest time in her life. Her husband dies down there in Moab. My God is king, is dead. And then her sons marry, not marry fellow Israelis, but marry outside of family and outside of faith. They marry Moabite girls. And then they are childless. And then they too die. Both of them. I've been pastor long enough to have seen tragedy rock families in the church and seen a tragedy happen, and I say to myself, how can that family hold up under that? That's incredible. I don't know what I'd do if that happened to me. And then you look around and maybe a few months or a couple years go by and you see another heavy thing happen. And you wonder how people can bear up under such mighty blows. Naomi is that kind of person. She has those incredible blows that hit her life. Relocation, the loss of husband, the loss of sons. And she begins to become bitter, and we understand that. She is bitter with the move, the migration. She becomes bitter over the death of her husband. She has right to be bitter over the death of her sons, and she also acknowledges she's past the age of mothering, verse 12. And she's even bitter against God. She says, verse 13, chapter 1, it's more bitter, talking to her daughters-in-law, it's more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. God has dealt roughly with me, she's saying. And she reflects what a lot of us do. When bad things happen to us in life, we find it natural to equate reverses with God's direct action. Well, God himself finally doesn't like me. That's why this has happened. These kinds of things don't happen to somebody that God approves, that God likes. Therefore, since the negative has happened, it means God himself has gone out against me. And God gets, by the way, blamed for a lot of things he's really not responsible for, but his shoulders are big and he can take it. Reminds me of the little boy who poked holes in his newly painted bedroom. His parents, who had worked hard on that bedroom, were furious at this mischief and came into his room, and they were ready to administer the Board of Education to the seat of knowledge. And they asked him why he had poked holes in his newly painted bedroom walls, and he said, desperate for an answer, he said, well, I asked God if it was okay, and he didn't say no. God gets blamed for a lot of things. But tears happen in life. Sometimes we think God made them. Irma Bombeck a few years ago had a great Mother's Day story. I want to take a moment to read it to you. She said, when the good Lord was creating mothers, he was into his 6th day of overtime when the angel appeared and said, you're doing a lot of fiddling around on this one. And the Lord said, have you read the specs on this order? She has to be completely washable, but not plastic. Have 180 movable parts, all replaceable. Run on black coffee and leftovers. Have a lap that disappears when she stands up. And have a kiss that can cure anything from a broken leg to a disappointed teenager's crushed heart. And 6 pairs of hands. The angel shook its head slowly and said, 6 pairs of hands? No way. It's not the hands that are causing me the problem, the good Lord said. It's the 3 pairs of eyes that mothers have to have. That's on the standard model? Asked the angel. The Lord nodded. 1 pair that sees through the closed doors when she asks, what are you kids doing in there? When she already knows. Another pair in the back of her head that allows her to see what she shouldn't, but what she has to know. And of course, the eyes out in front so that she can look at a child when he goofs and say, without saying a word, with those eyes, I understand you and I love you. Lord, said the angel, touching his sleeve gently, come to bed tomorrow. I can't, said the Lord. I'm so close to creating something so close to myself. Already I have one who heals herself when she is sick, can feed a family of 6 on 1 pound of hamburger, and can get a 9-year-old to stand under a shower. The angel circled the model of a mother very slowly and sighed, it's so soft. But tough, said the Lord excitedly. You cannot imagine what this mother can do or endure. Can it think? Not only think, but it can reason and compromise, said the Creator. Finally, the angel bent over and ran its finger across the cheek. There's a leak, the angel pronounced. I told you you were trying to put too much into this model. It's not a leak, said the Lord. It's a tear. What's it for? It's for joy, sadness, disappointment, pain, loneliness, and pride. Said the angel, "You're a genius." Said the Lord, looking somber, "I didn't put the tear there." The woman of Naomi believes the Lord put the tear there in her life. And she goes back home and she says, "It's time to change my name. Don't call me lovely, delightful, and pleasant anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter." That's what Mara means, because the Lord Almighty has made me bitter. Moffat translates the verse as follows, verse 21 of chapter 1, "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has cruelly marred me." She came back to the Pentecostal church in Bethlehem. She'd used a term that we used in churches I grew up in. She'd have been called Sister, and instead of being now Sister Beautiful, Sister Lovely, can you imagine calling her Sister Bitter? I've known some people like that, but they didn't say to call them Sister Bitter. We just did it of our own accord. But she says, "Call me Sister Bitter." I got to thinking, how would I help her if I were her pastor? And there are some ways I would not try to deal with her. For example, I would not agree with her. I would not say, "Well, Naomi, I agree. God's dealt cruelly with you. There must have been something wrong with your life." I would have said, life does have its tough times and its good times. Stay in it for all of it. Nor would I put her down. I would not say to her, "Well, Naomi, you're not exactly God's woman of faith and power, or all of this wouldn't have happened in your life." Nor would I have said to her, "Naomi, you're an older woman and you should stop grumping around so much. And the Lord tells us, give thanks in all things. So I want you to quit being so droopy and mopey and dopey. And I want you to get a smile on your face, or don't come back to this church until you're looking happy." Boy, we can so easily put people down. Nor would I have given her an instant solution. Said, "Oh, Naomi, there's a trick. There's a trick to this. We're all into microwaves, aren't we, in our culture? Just get the quick solution." I saw the other day some phony religious program had advertised that all your sins would be forgiven if you'd send them $25. It was about to that, and I thought, only people that aren't into the Word would ever fall for a thing like that. But we would like quick solutions, and it's these long-haul situations that are the difficulty. I had to say to her, "Naomi, some things don't turn around overnight. That involves developing staying power in your life. Character produces endurance." But I would have tried to affirm her. I would have tried to say to her, "Naomi, you've done some things right. I know, Naomi, you're looking at everything that went wrong, but look at the things you've done right. You've kept your faith in God, haven't you? No, I know that right now that you're a little bitter against God, but you haven't thrown God out of your life, have you? You still love Him. You still serve Him. And Naomi, you've showed some genuine love to your daughters-in-law. Look at how Ruth absolutely adores you. I know enough about human bitterness to know that a person who is more than 50% bitter in their life, that is, if that becomes a dominating, controlling thing, is going to drive other people away from them, because there's so much caustic acid in their life that it's going to spill out and corrode anybody that gets near them. So those people, for self-protection, are going to back away and want to create large amounts of room. But Naomi's calling herself bitter, but evidently there was enough lovely, delightful, and pleasant that she won a daughter-in-law's heart. And that daughter-in-law was willing to leave her family and trek out across the wilderness to take up a new home with a strange people and say, "Where you go, I go, and your God will be my God. Your home will be my home." So you've done some things right, Naomi, and every mother here, no matter if maybe you have legitimate reason to be depressed today on Mother's Day. Perhaps you didn't get the card or phone call or flowers you were expecting. But that doesn't mean that everything you've done in life is bad. You've done some good. And I would give Naomi some hope if I were her pastor. I'd remind her that her own scriptures, which she had at the time, contain a story of a widowed person, this time a man. Naomi was a widow, here was a widower. And he thought his son, next to youngest son, was dead when actually the son was still alive down in Egypt. And then his other sons had gone down in a time of famine to get grain. And the son whom he thought was dead was actually in charge, incognito, of the granary resources. And he wanted the youngest son to come down, and while waiting for the youngest son to be delivered, kept Simeon, one of the older boys. And Jacob is at the absolute wit's end in life. He is in winter, if ever a man was in winter. He says in chapter 42 of Genesis, verse 36, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Exactly what Naomi is saying. Everything is against me. But the very moment that he is feeling everything's against him, there is a wonderful solution that is on its way. And things are not as they seem. I would tell Naomi, don't pass judgment on your life until the Lord is finished with it. And He may not even be finished with your life in your lifetime. We don't know what good God may work out of our reverses. So hang in there. Naomi did hang in there, and it became spring. When the voice of the turtle dove was heard again in the land, the sound of the gentle rains, the green grass, the flowering bush, the leafing tree, the gentle breezes, spring. And that springtime for Naomi brought a time of romance for her daughter-in-law, Ruth, which Naomi lived through kind of vicariously. And in this time of spring, Naomi has a chance to refocus on the future and come out of her bitterness toward the past. Ruth goes out into the fields to glean, which shows us they were poor people. They didn't have regular employment, so that the poorest of the land took the scraps of the harvest that were left over at the corners of the field. God in His mercy had said to the farmers, you could never harvest the corners, and don't pick up the droppings, leave those for the poor people. So if somebody dropped a sheaf with grain in it, it was to lie there, not to be picked up, out of mercy toward the poor. And Ruth was one of those poor persons. And Boaz, older than she, saw her and had a wonderful conversation with her and gave orders that people should drop more grain than normal. And so she picks up 5 gallons full and goes home with it. Had Naomi chosen to remain in winter and in her bitterness, she would have said something like this to Ruth, "Where did you get all that grain?" Take a lesson from me, daughter-in-law. Never trust a man. Guy has evil intentions. I don't care if he is my relative. You know, we can so often color things by our attitudes. But Naomi instead says, the Lord has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead. She begins to change. And she helps Ruth's faith grow until Ruth's faith goes strong enough to really initiate a marriage proposal. I think it's kind of neat to dip back 3,000 years and find out even back then it was okay for a gal to take initiation in a relationship. It doesn't always have to be the man. I guess I'm modern enough to believe that. I think it's nice that we have all these archetypal kinds of deals. But here we have a situation where Ruth basically initiates the marriage proposal. And she's letting poor, shy, and Boaz has a poor self-concept because he's older and unmarried and probably thinks nobody wants him, you know. He's really a neat guy. He's probably ugly. That's probably why he wasn't married. But he's probably, you know, nobody had ever gotten past looking at his face to look at his heart, you know. And so he has a low self-concept, and he needs somebody who will gently, you know, open some doors and make it look like marriage was his idea. And Ruth does all that for him. And then Ruth comes back and reports that Boaz has got to go to the marketplace that day because marriage in those days was a real estate transaction. And Ruth came with the property of Naomi's dead husband. And somebody else had the nearer right of redemption. But Naomi assures Ruth in those tension-filled moments, it's going to be okay. The man will not rest until the matter is settled today. She breathes faith into her. And blessing pours into Naomi's life through her loving daughter, Ruth, who does not abandon her when Ruth finds her own happiness in marriage. Instead, we read in chapter 4, verse 16, "Then Naomi took the child," because a child was born to this union of Boaz and Ruth. Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. And in that verse, you see the three important components of motherhood. The first component is a decision to accept a child. She took the child. Then a decision to love the child. She laid him in her lap. That laying in lap signifies love. And third, a decision to nurture. She cared for him. So that the women said, Naomi has a son, not a grandson. Naomi has a son. And they called him Obed, which means worshiper. And the rest of the story doesn't come out for 100 years. 4 generations down the road, from Boaz to Obed to Jesse to David, king of Israel. 100 years goes by, and a great-great-grandson will be born whom Naomi never knew. But unless she'd had the summer, fall, and winter of her life, this boy would have never come into the world of Hebrew and Moabite blood to be king of Israel and a model of the Good Shepherd. Naomi had to return home for all the good things to happen in her life, because it was at home that Ruth would meet Boaz. We have to return home too if we're to ever see springtime. If you're away from the Lord today, you're not at home. What a better day than today to come home to Christ. Some of you may be the child of a mother who prayed for you, and you're away from Christ today. You need the winter to end in your life and God's presence to be part of your life. I've told this story once before, but I have a new PS, so I'll tell it again. I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon my own mother. I have a brother and a sister. My sister is also part of this congregation. She was in the 8 o'clock service. And then there's my brother, both older than I. My sister being the oldest, and I won't give her age, and my brother, who's 5 years older than I. My brother was the archetypal preacher's kid. If there was trouble to be gotten into, he got into it. I was always the good kid who did everything right. Actually, the reason why I was so good was that I saw how my brother got the razor strap from my dad, and I just had a pain-pleasure principle developed early in my life, that if the pain is going to be worse than the pleasure, forego the pleasure. It was just a very simple lesson. I do that even today when eating food. If something's going to cause me discomfort later, I'll forego it now because, well, it's just the pleasure-pain principle. My brother got into everything. I remember in Northwest China, we didn't have baseball cards to trade, but every boy that was worth his salt traded pigeons, had a pigeon collection. My brother stole money off the dresser at night that my dad had set out to buy pigeons and had a whole collection of pigeons, the best collection, in fact, in town, before my dad got wind of the fact that my brother had a pigeon collection. I remember once a neighbor in Bristow, Oklahoma, a lady came up to the door. My mother answered. She said, "I wish your son would quit parking his car in front of my house every night. I'm sick and tired of that old jalopy sitting out there." To which my mother naively replied, "My son doesn't have a car." My brother had simply forged my dad's name on the title and got a car. I'm saying all this because you're going to meet him in several weeks. He's going to be out, and I don't want to say this in his presence. In fact, Paul doesn't look anything like me. When I was a kid, one of the greatest afflictions I had is I thought that probably they mixed up babies in the bassinets in the hospital, and I got in the wrong family because I didn't look like anybody in it. But anyway, my brother ultimately went on to Bible school and then went into the ministry for a short time and dropped out of the ministry and backslid, totally went away from the Lord. Loving husband, a loving father, 3 beautiful girls that are all raised and mothers today, but just lived his adult life away from the Lord. Made no bones about it. And when my mother had her heart attack in October of 1979, which was to take her life, we hospitalized her. A whole week had gone by and she was seemingly recovering, and then on Saturday, October 27th, Paul was scheduled to leave town the next day. Suddenly, Mom had a turn for the worse. Her blood pressure and heart rate dropped dramatically. They rushed her down to ICU. I was back in Costa Mesa, and the call came, "You better get out." My dad called me and said, "George, you better get out here. Something's happening with Mom." So I got in the car and arrived out in Redlands too late. But in those moments when I was driving out there, my brother was there and my sister were there. And my mother, with a very low heart rate and a very weak pulse, summoned all the energy she could. She cried out as strong as she could. Paul, Paul. My brother was out in the waiting room because he just couldn't bear the thought of being in his mom's presence, nor really could any of us as she was dying. We loved her so much. But she knew my brother knew when Mom called Paul, Paul, that she wanted him. She was summoning him to her bed. Just like her prayers for me, she had prayed for that boy every day of his life and prayed many long hours for him. Paul came to the bedside. He knew exactly what to say. My brother is very perceptive, very intuitive. He knelt at her bedside, and he put his lips right up to her ears where she could hear him. And he said, Mom, I'll see you in heaven. He knew that that's why Mom had really called him. She wanted to hear that. She was fighting not to let go until she heard that. And as soon as Paul said that, she let out a breath, and it was the end. It was some time before Paul really acted on that commitment. A number of years went by, but a couple of years ago, Paul really took a step. He'd been dogged by a lifelong addiction to cigarettes, and just several months ago, he came off and he's clean free. And 2 weeks ago, he called me and he said, George, says strange things happening in my life, and you're not going to believe this. And I already knew he'd been, like he's no longer, he has been helping his nephew in a ministry project. He said, George, he said, I think the Lord may be calling me back to the pastorate. I am thinking about re-entering the ministry. I said to my sister, and she said to me, oh, if Mother could only be alive to hear this, she would be beside herself. But she is alive to hear it, because we have a heavenly grandstand of witnesses. And the Lord is saying to us, hang with it through the winter months. Stay for the springtime. Keep praying and keep believing for God to do His work in your life. He's going to complete it. Our Lord, today we take a moment and we bow our hearts in prayer, and we want to give you thanks for the homes from which we've come. Whether our memories of that home are good or not, we want to thank you because it's been so vital in the shaping of our own life and where we're at. And there's a treasure there, Lord, of what we've become as a result of the imprint our mother has left upon us. We ask you to help us to forgive and to have healed any hurtful memories. We want to treasure and guard all the good memories. We also, Lord, want to be people who are people of faith, who in the midst of the high and low seasons of life remain your people. There will be days and months and epochs, Lord, in our life when, like Naomi, we'll be wondering, what's happening to us? We didn't ask for this. Why did we get this? How come life served us such a cruel pitch? But it is in those moments, Lord, that we need to reach out and keep trusting you and know that in you, the trend of life is always exactly that. It is a trend toward life and not toward death. And as we hang around you, and as you live in us and we live in you, we will find more and more life advancing in us and death retreating. Even as we grow older and from a physical appearance it appears that death is winning against us, we know, because we are yours, that life is winning, because you are the resurrection and the life, and you came to give us life and life abundantly. So we ask to hang true to you in those difficult times. And we want to thank you for all the mothers here today and for all their children. We know that something of your heart is seen in the witness of a good mother. While our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed, maybe you're here today and you do not have faith in the Lord. Perhaps your mother had faith, but for whatever reason, you've not lived as a child of God or as a person who follows Jesus Christ. I'd like to give you an invitation to come to Jesus Christ today and to acknowledge Him as Lord of your heart and life. I'd like to ask you to open a door in your heart today to Him. If that describes you, would you just slip up a hand? You'd say, by that upraised hand, Pastor, this Mother's Day, I'd like to turn my life to Jesus Christ. I'd like to turn my heart toward home. Is there a hand anywhere? To my left, center, or to the right? God sees your hand and He sees your heart. Lord, let all of us be people who walk with You, and help those of us who are parents and grandparents to transmit a vital faith to our children and to their children's children. Help our influence as parents to go on. Help us, Lord, to live for You and serve You. In Jesus' name, amen.